When famine strikes, the measure of human loyalty is revealed not in abundance, but in scarcity. Today we confront a hidden question in the Irish Potato Blight. Did survival expose a cruelty within the heart of women that history dared not speak aloud? The Irish potato famine was not only a tale of hunger and loss, but also a mirror that revealed how men and women behaved when civilization's veil was torn away. Beneath the silence of the fields and the cries of the starving, another truth emerged. A story whispered, not written, of how loyalty, compassion, and betrayal shifted when survival became the only law. In this telling, we do not chase judgment, but rather understanding. What happens to the bond between man and woman when the harvest turns to dust? When the soil withers and the harvest dies, a man discovers not only the weakness of his belly, but the weakness of his heart. In Ireland, when the blight blackened the potatoes, it did more than strip away the food of a people. It stripped away the masks that men and women wore in times of plenty. The fields that once promised life became a mirror of the spirit, showing who could endure with dignity and who would turn to cruelty when bread no longer filled the mouth. The famine was not only a matter of hunger, it was a revelation of character. A hungry land is a merciless teacher. In the village before the famine, neighbors exchanged kindness, shared laughter, and promised loyalty. Men provided, women nurtured, and the rhythm of life carried on. But when the potato crop rotted into slime, those bonds became brittle, breaking under the weight of starvation. In such times, generosity becomes costly, and compassion turns into a burden too heavy for many to carry. The true soul of a person is revealed not when their table overflows, but when it lies empty. The cruelty that emerged was not always loud. Sometimes it whispered in quiet refusals, in the turning of the head when a starving child begged for bread. Sometimes it was found in the eyes of a wife who once swore devotion, but who now looked upon her husband as a failing provider, a man who no longer had value because he could not keep her stomach from gnawing itself in pain. Hunger sharpens judgment, and in that sharpness, affection can wither like a leaf in frost. The famine exposed this truth. When the body is in torment, the heart may betray its highest vows. Many stories passed in whispers, of women leaving husbands who had no land, of affection given to men who still had scraps of grain or a hidden store of oats, of loyalty traded for survival. Men who once stood strong in their homes felt their pride broken as famine taught them that their worth was measured not by love, but by their ability to provide. And so the cruelty was double. Edged, the famine punished the body with hunger and the spirit with betrayal. Yet one must understand this cruelty not as a deliberate evil, but as a law of desperation. Hunger is a master that bends the will. A starving mother may choose another hearth, not because love compels her, but because her children's cries leave her no choice. In the famine fields, kindness and cruelty became twin shadows, difficult to tell apart. For each act of betrayal was also an act of survival. To the husband left behind, it was treachery. To the woman who fled, it was necessity. And thus the famine revealed how fragile loyalty could be when tested by the weight of empty stomachs. The soul of Ireland itself seemed caught in this tension. Once a land bound by kinship, now the famine drove wedges between families, friends, and lovers. Neighbors who once shared seed now closed their doors in fear that their last meal would be taken. A woman who once would have comforted her starving neighbor's child now turned away, clutching her own child to her chest. Cruelty and compassion were no longer separated by a wide river. They flowed together in the same stream, each action carrying both love for one and coldness for another. What the famine taught, above all, is that hunger unmasks. In the absence of bread, words lose their sweetness, and promises lose their weight. A smile cannot feed a belly, and a vow cannot stop the wasting of the body. The famine carved this lesson into the hearts of those who lived through it. Hunger reveals the soul as surely as fire reveals the strength of iron. And when the fields gave no food, the heart gave its truth. A promise made in times of abundance carries little weight compared to a promise tested by hunger. In the villages of Ireland, before the Blight, a woman's vow to her husband was bound with laughter, song, and the steady rhythm of the harvest. There was always bread on the table, milk in the pail, and potatoes in the pit. In such a world, loyalty seemed unshakable, for the soil was generous and the table never bare. But when the Blight swept across the fields, darkening the very food that was life itself, vows faced their truest trial. An empty bowl became more powerful than the softest words of devotion. The famine gnawed not only at bodies, but at bonds. The man who could no longer fill the pot lost more than his strength. He lost his place in the heart of the woman who once looked at him with respect. To be a husband was not only to be loved, but to be a provider. And when provision collapsed, so too did the foundation of loyalty. Hunger turned the measure of a man into the measure of his grain. And women, driven by fear of death, began to look beyond their vows to the men who still had food. This was not always out of cruelty, but out of the simple, sharp truth that a starving woman cannot cradle promises when her children's mouths are empty. The famine revealed a terrible hierarchy of loyalty. A woman's heart may have belonged to her husband, but her survival often demanded that her loyalty belong to the man who still held food. Some women became bound to landlords who had hoarded grain, others to men who possessed a hidden stash of meal, still others to strangers whose hands could still provide bread. In such choices, affection gave way to necessity, and what once was sacred became transactional. A vow that had been made in church was now weighed against the cries of the stomach, and the stomach's cry proved louder. Men felt this betrayal like a wound deeper than hunger. For the famine robbed them not only of their crops, but of their dignity, their role as protectors and providers. To watch a wife's loyalty falter in the shadow of the empty bowl was to taste a bitterness beyond starvation. Many men remembered the days when they had labored tirelessly, certain that their devotion and hard work would bind their wives to them forever. Yet famine does not honor memory. Famine judges only the present moment, and in that present moment, a man without food became a man without worth. But cruelty in famine wears many faces. It would be easy to condemn the women who turned their loyalty toward those with bread. Yet one must imagine the hunger that drives such choices. A mother may betray her husband, not because she has ceased to love him, but because she cannot bear to watch her children wither into skeletons. Her cruelty toward her husband is, in her mind, an act of mercy toward her offspring. The famine twisted loyalty into knots, so that even betrayal carried the shadow of love. What was once clear became murky. What was once sacred became negotiable. The image of the Famine Queen emerged from this turmoil. Women who survived not because of loyalty to one man, but because of their ability to attach themselves to those who still had food. Some despised them, others envied them, but all understood that famine does not permit easy judgments. To be loyal in the face of death was noble, but nobility does not feed the body. And so, Many chose survival, even if survival demanded the breaking of vows once thought unbreakable. As the famine deepened, the stories multiplied. Wives abandoning husbands too weak to work the land, women aligning themselves with men who could provide shelter and scraps of meal. Daughters married off quickly to households where food still lingered. Each story carried the same refrain. The empty bowl was the true master of loyalty. Women who once swore to stand beside their husbands in all things found that hunger drew a line they could not cross. Men, stripped of their role as providers, discovered that love is fragile when measured against survival. In the silence of the famine nights, when the cries of the hungry echoed through the cottages, many men must have asked themselves if love was ever truly unconditional, or if it was always tethered to the soil and the harvest. Women, too, must have carried the weight of their choices, torn between the heart's devotion and the body's demands. In this struggle, the famine revealed a truth older than Ireland itself. Loyalty is tested not by fullness, but by famine, and the empty bowl has the power to undo the strongest vow. When the famine swept across Ireland, the land grew silent, but the silence was not peace. It was the silence of empty fields, of withered stalks, of bellies rumbling in the night. Into this silence came a harsh truth: affection could no longer stand as a matter of feeling alone. Hunger, like a great judge, weighed every bond and transformed love into a negotiation. What once was spoken in warmth now became measured in bread, and what once was devotion became transaction. Survival pressed its hand upon every heart, forcing people to ask not what they felt, but what they could gain. In days before the Blight, love was adorned with ceremony, with dances, with whispered words under the moon. A man gave his labor, a woman gave her loyalty, and together they built homes where laughter and song had a place. But when the potatoes rotted and the harvests failed, that balance cracked. The worth of a man was no longer measured in his promises or in his tenderness, but in his ability to secure food. To love a man who could not feed you was to invite death into your cottage, and famine does not honor poetry. Thus affection became currency, traded and bargained in the shadow of hunger's whip. Women who once looked at their husbands with gentle devotion began to measure their future in harsher terms. Could this man still provide? Could he still protect? Could he still guard her against the specter of starvation? If the answer was no, her eyes turned elsewhere. It was not always with cruelty or malice, but with the cold calculation that comes when survival is at stake. The famine transformed tender bonds into harsh choices, and many men, once confident in their wives' fidelity, found themselves abandoned in the darkness of need. Men, too, felt the weight of this bargain. They who had once held pride in their calloused hands and steady backs discovered that their worth vanished when their fields failed them. A man without food became a man without honor, and worse, a man without love. What use was affection to a woman who could not eat? What use was devotion to a child whose belly ached? The famine left many men broken, not only in body but in spirit, stripped of the dignity that once made them strong in the eyes of their families. Affection turned into a thing to be traded. A woman might offer her loyalty to a man with grain hidden in his barn, though she did not love him. She might forsake the man she once cherished for the sake of one who could fill her bowl. Landlords and merchants became more than masters of property. They became masters of survival, for they held the food that others craved. Women, driven by desperation, sometimes bound themselves to these men in order to secure another day of life. Love was no longer measured in tenderness, but in how many mouths could be fed. In this way, the famine revealed that human connection, under the pressure of hunger, bends into forms unrecognizable from its original shape. What had once been considered sacred could be reshaped by desperation. The kiss of love became a bargain for a loaf of bread. The promise of fidelity became a transaction sealed by survival. Hunger does not honor the sanctity of vows. Hunger makes every bond conditional. It does not ask what the heart desires, but what the body requires. The cruelty of this transformation lay in its quietness. There were no declarations, no open confessions of betrayal. Rather, there were choices made in silence, in secret, in the dim hours of famine nights. A woman stepping across the threshold of another man's cottage. A husband left staring at his empty hearth, knowing that hunger had claimed not only his food, but his wife's devotion. These stories carried with them a weight that cannot be softened by excuses. Yet they were born of necessity as much as of weakness. Even those who clung to loyalty felt its edges fray. A woman who stayed beside her starving husband still felt the temptation of survival gnawing at her spirit. A man who remained faithful to his family still bore the shame of knowing that his failure to provide endangered them all. Affection, in this world of famine, became fragile, trembling like a candle in the wind. And always, hunger stood waiting to blow it out. The famine carved this truth into every heart it touched. Survival does not walk hand in hand with affection. Where once love had been given freely, it became measured, bargained, weighed against the value of grain and meal. The famine turned devotion into a coin to be exchanged, and in doing so, revealed the most bitter lesson of all, that in the shadow of starvation, even love must bow to survival. The famine in Ireland was more than a calamity of the soil. It was a calamity of the spirit. The blight did not simply kill the potato, it stripped away the comforts that shielded human nature from its harsher truths. In those years of darkness, when bowls lay empty and the cries of hunger filled the air, masks fell from faces. Compassion and cruelty, love and betrayal, loyalty and survival, they stood side by side, often inseparable, often tangled within the same act. The fields became a proving ground, not only for bodies but for bonds. Men discovered that their strength was measured not in their words, but in their capacity to provide. Women learned that devotion could not feed their children, and that loyalty to a starving man might mean sharing his grave. Promises once sacred became fragile when tested against the silence of an empty bowl. The famine revealed that survival reshapes every bond. Affection became a bargain, fidelity a transaction, and trust a fleeting luxury. Yet within this revelation lies a deeper understanding that hunger, more than any force, unmasks the human soul. It shows us the limits of loyalty, the price of survival, and the cruel bargains made when the harvest fails. The story of the famine is not only about crops or hunger. It is about the raw truth of human nature when all else is stripped away. It forces us to ask what endures when the earth no longer feeds us, and whether love, loyalty, or compassion can survive the shadow of desperation.